headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
So, Desmond, I'm sure you were whooping with joy when you found out all those restrictions were going to end yesterday.
I was. I shouted hallelujah.
I have to say, it does feel like a long time coming. But, I mean, we did immediately hear from the usual suspects. We know who those people are going, you know, this is very dangerous. There's no evidence for this. Where is the scientific evidence for what is clearly a political decision? Rather ignoring the fact that all of the decisions to lock down and impose any restrictions, whether it was Scotch eggs or banning people from funerals and things, were fundamentally political decisions themselves, and very little of it has ever been based on any scientific evidence at all.
Well, quite. And they have been wrong and cried wolf all along. And they have it coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing I was saying this bit earlier on the show, and if people missed it, put it out on YouTube and on Twitter and other social media. This idea that, well, to give people back their freedoms, you need to show the scientific proof and the evidence. No, to take away people's freedoms, you need to show strong scientific proof and evidence. And we've never had that. What we've had is modelling, and the likes of Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University we spoke to earlier, and many others pointing out that modelling may seem reasonable at the start of a pandemic with a virus you don't know about, but when you're 2 years in and you're still relying on modelling from organisations that have proven themselves to be so catastrophically, laughably wrong in their predictions and forecasts and scenarios, whatever they're calling them this week before, rather than relying on the real world evidence from around the world, then, I mean, frankly, you've given up on the idea of scientific evidence at all, haven't you?
Well, you have. I mean, I'm not against modelling in principle. What I've been against is the way that the modellers have expressed such confidence in what was only a model. They have the assumptions upon which their modelling were based were often out of date, out of touch, unrealistic, and basically they got it wrong. Even with this latest Omicron variant, I remember having a briefing from the chief scientist and the chief medical officer when the information coming from South Africa was clear that this was a significantly less potent variation. And all we got during that briefing was, no, you can't make any assumption about that. They've got a younger population. They don't have any old people. They've been more exposed to it. They've been less vaccinated, but they've been more exposed to it. All sorts of caveats were introduced to stop us adopting a common sense approach.
Yeah, we've not seen much common sense, have we? I mean, I think back to Scotch eggs and even, you know, rule of six and goodness knows what else. A lot of people will be saying, like you and me, thank goodness this is at the end. But it's not at the end, is it? The reality is, on March the 24th, that emergency legislation for the Coronavirus Act was going to end. The Prime Minister would need an awful lot of his backbenchers to support that, for that to go forward and that to continue. He was not going to get that support. And even if there were enough Labour votes to get that through, along with the payroll vote of ministerial aides and ministers, we would still have seen, realistically, 54 letters plus, probably a lot more than that, going into the 1922 committee to oust the Prime Minister. But this isn't over, because we still have the Public Health Act, under which actually most of the most draconian rules that have limited our lives and our freedoms have been enacted. We still have SAGE in place, the Chief Scientific Advisor, Chief Medical Officer in place, who have presided over all of this and demanded more and more restrictions. The only time they weren't doing that, by the way, was in March 2020, when they were still following sensible pandemic guidelines that had been established for decades. So this could still happen. I mean, we see cases going up again, which we will. Of course we will. Even though people are double jabbed, many triple jabbed, we are still going to see demands for there to be more restrictions on our lives. How do we stop that from happening again?
Well, first of all, you're right. The agenda must be to reform the Public Health Act and put the same sort of parliamentary scrutiny into it and accountability that is in the Civil Contingencies Act. That's why they didn't use the Civil Contingencies Act or indeed the Coronavirus Act, because they've got this Act from 1984, which basically allowed them to do whatever they pleased. Yeah. So that's the first item of the agenda. The second coming up is this to be an inquiry into all this. And the danger is that the conclusion of the inquiry, and we've already seen this being the turf being rolled for this is that if only you had locked down harder and sooner, so many lives would have been saved, contrary to all the evidence we had, the John Hopkins study last week. But nevertheless, that is the danger. Yeah. And it is a danger that is catching, in the sense that on a typical winter's day, 300 people will die of flu.
No, we don't care about them. We don't care about people who die of flu or of cancer or heart attacks. No, they don't matter. They're not on the daily news every night.
But the danger is that what we have is a policy now that could be implemented every time there is an NHS winter crisis. And when wasn't there an NHS winter crisis? Yeah. And the danger is that you adopt this as a policy to manage hospital admissions. Now, we've already been here because the first inquiry, which reported in the autumn, was that of the Joint Commons Health Select Committee and Science and Technology Health Committee. And their report, published all of the papers, came to exactly that conclusion. Well, I acquired a copy of the report myself and read it, and it doesn't say anything of the sort. It says the need to lock down was a policy failure based on the fact that we hadn't, unlike the Taiwanese who never locked down, we hadn't got a proper track and trace system in place. So be careful what you read. Be careful
and how it's reported.
Rethink for yourself.
And indeed, I'm amazed by the number of people who say, like, the science is for whether it's masking children in classrooms or whatever it is. And I always say, I don't care who says it. I want to know on what evidence they're making that statement. And when you ask the evidence, when we finally got the evidence from Nadhim Zahawi, the Education Secretary, for why children should be wearing masks in the classroom, they produced their evidence. And the evidence was that there was no evidence that it would save a single COVID infection, let alone a life. Their argument that it was about saving children not being away from school. There was no evidence of that at all. And on the contrary, the one study that Nadhim Zahawi had noted on the show specifically showed the evidence to the contrary, that actually the schools where they were unmasked saw fewer days off. I mean, it is laughable, except it's so serious. And you know, and I know, and all my listeners know, that we are going to be living with the consequences of this, not for a few months or a few years. We're going to be living with it for decades. Children who have been scarred for life, losing education, the mental health problems, the people who didn't get treated for cancer. There's some talk that it could be up to over 80,000 people who were not referred for cancer treatment, who have got cancer, have no idea they've got cancer, and may well end up dying sooner as a result. But, their numbers aren't going to be on the news every night. We're going to be living with this, the economic damage, paying for everything, every aspect of this for decades, and we're all going to face it. So can we try and get something, if we're going to have our Prime Minister limping along before those 54 letters go in, weakened, having to do the bidding of his backbenchers, can we get Public Health Act reformed? Can we get a proper cost-benefit analysis and clear evidence of benefits massively, not just on a vague possibility, massively being better than the cost, for having to be required by law before any restrictions on our lives can ever be brought in again? Is there any way of getting that through Parliament so that we can actually get that safeguard for next time? Because there is going to be a next time.
Well, that is a tall order. That's a big ask.
My vote at the next general election is going to be based on that.
Based on a rather dodgy premise that the Prime Minister is limping along, and I'm not sure that that's the case.
Really? You don't think he is?
But certainly, I believe that it is our job as parliamentarians to deliver what you have just asked for. That is on my tick list. Whether I'll get it, I'm not clairvoyant. It's too soon to tell.
In terms of Partygate, the new picture of the Prime Minister, and again, I couldn't care less about the Prime Minister having a bottle of champagne at a quiz and someone wearing tinsel. Couldn't care less, apart from the fact he explicitly banned everyone else from doing the same thing, because we were all going to die and cause the collapse of the NHS, when he knew that wasn't true, and he did it anyway. And you knew it wasn't true because you can see he was quite happily at an event himself. It's just one of many. Should the Prime Minister face prosecution for attendance at any of these events? We've got 50 people going to be questioned by the Met Police. And if he does, or prosecution, if he does get a fine, He says apparently privately that he won't resign. Should he resign if he gets fined by the police for breaking COVID rules?
I'll cross that bridge when I come to it.
Why can't you answer that question now?
I've only just seen the photograph now for the first time.
No, but you know what we've been hearing about. If what he has done is judged by the police to have been a breach of the laws that he brought in for everyone else, does he have to resign as far as you're concerned? Yes or no? You must know the answer to that.
There's a whole series of facts that one needs to know before one reaches that conclusion. And, hey, there's a police inquiry going on. I'll wait for the outcome.
OK, and if the outcome is that he has to pay a fine...
a bridge to cross when I get to it. It's all very well saying, what if? Well, there are so many ifs.
No, there aren't. Because Sir Desmond, this is predicated on the very simple idea that if a Prime Minister brings in laws that massively infringe people's liberties, close down businesses, get children not being able to see their loved ones and go to school, and families divided, I mean, absolutely horrific damage to our civil liberties. If he brings in those rules and he tells us they're for saving lives and he breaks those rules himself behind closed doors on repeated basis, it would appear. No one is questioning that he was at these events. There's photographic evidence by all accounts. That's what's being investigated. If those are deemed to have broken COVID rules, there's only one premise. If those are deemed and he gets fined, should he resign from the office?
I'll reflect on that when it happens. Okay. What I'm clear in my own mind is that the Prime Minister isn't a liar.
Really? Where'd you get that from?
Because I'm absolutely certain that in his own mind, however mistaken it may or may not have been, but in his mind, he viewed these as work events.
But no, he did. He may well have done so. Sir Desmond, he may well have done so. But the reality is he had explicitly banned other people at work from having such work events.
The first few weeks of the first lockdown, explaining to any number of constituents, principally sole traders, small business people, the difference between regulation and guidance, and also the fact that both the guidance and the regulation differed for places of work as from dwellings. And normally my reaction when people ask me for advice is to say, I'm not qualified to give advice. And what's more, when it turns out to be bad advice,
you get the blame. Sir Desmond, there is not a scintilla of doubt in my mind, as someone who was out at work the entire time pretty much the entire time after certainly June onwards, 2020, that we were quite specifically banned from having any events at work that were not purely work-related. If you got tinsel on and you've got a bottle of champagne, it ain't work-related. We were banned from doing it. You weren't at Tier 3, December 2020, we were banned from even meeting one other person in our own homes or meeting anyone in an office that was not purely for work purposes. So I'm sorry, the Prime Minister has lied. He may be lying to himself as well, but he has lied to us. I'm going to have to leave it there. Sir Desmond Swain, I know you're desperate to come back in. I'm going to leave it. Conservative MP Sir Desmond Swain.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.